under fragmented lumen strips and intermittent Auspex returns, early recovery teams recorded repeated sightings of small, hovering constructs drifting through derelict corridors and collapsed sanctums. Picked feeds show skull-shaped forms moving with deliberate stability, their trajectories corrected by unseen guidance systems rather than biological reflex. Witness accounts remain consistent across centuries and sectors. The objects neither vocalized nor reacted with apparent emotion, yet they maintained proximity to sanctioned personnel and withdrew from unsanctioned movement patterns. In several instances, Auspex logs confirm low-output energy signatures comparable to compact power cells rather than organic life signs. Examination of debris fields and shrine vaults revealed similar objects suspended in stasis niches, preserved alongside reliquaries, data slates, and ossified remains. The consistency of construction suggests centralized doctrinal approval rather than local improvisation. Ecclesiastical archives reference their presence as early as the Great Crusade era, while Mechanicus records notes standardized interfaces and sanctified housings. The recovered picked feeds conclude with a single annotation added during later cataloguing, identifying the subject of these recurring findings as Servo Skulls. The earliest confirmed origins of Servo Skulls are traced to the unification period of Terror and the subsequent Great Crusade, when the Imperium of Man required durable, compact servitors capable of operating in confined or hazardous environments. Unlike full servitors, which were constructed from living human subjects subjected to extensive cybernetic augmentation, Servo Skulls represented a more specialized application. The foundational component was a human cranium, typically stripped of soft tissue and ritually prepared. Canon sources indicate that these skulls were most often taken from honored dead, condemned criminals whose sentences included post-mortem service, or sanctioned donors whose remains were tied to the Adeptus Mechanicus or ecclesiarchy. The selection process was governed by strict legal and theological frameworks, ensuring that the use of human remains aligned with imperial doctrine regarding the sanctity of the human form. Construction began with the cleansing and reinforcement of the skull structure. The cranium was treated with chemical preservatives and resin compounds to prevent degradation over extended operational lifespans that could span centuries. Internal cavities were expanded or reshaped to accommodate logic engines, memory wafers, and control relays. These components were not true artificial intelligences, as such constructs are forbidden under Imperial law following the Age of Strife. Instead, Servo Skulls relied on limited cogitator stacks capable of executing predefined routines, data storage, and simple adaptive behaviors. Their cognitive capacity remained intentionally constrained, ensuring compliance with the strictures of the cult Mechanicus and preventing autonomous decision-making beyond their programmed scope. The exterior of the skull was often reinforced with ceramite plating, plasteel bands, or brass inlays, depending on the intended function and the resources of the forge world or shrine that commissioned it. Optic augmetics replaced the natural eye sockets, ranging from simple picked recorders to advanced Auspex lenses capable of low-light amplification, thermal detection, or radiation scanning. These augmetics were standardized across many forge worlds, allowing interoperability with Imperial data systems. In some variants, the jaw was replaced or immobilized to house vox emitters, enabling the Servo Skull to transmit pre-recorded messages, relay orders, or broadcast liturgical phrases during rituals and inspections. Power sources within Servo Skulls were compact and designed for longevity rather than output. Most canon references describe the use of micro-power cells, or miniaturized plasma capacitors, sealed within the cranial cavity or mounted externally beneath sanctified housings. These power units were capable of sustaining continuous operation for decades before requiring recharge or replacement. In some ecclesiastical models, supplemental energy was drawn from photonic collectors integrated into purity seals or halo fixtures, allowing limited recharging when exposed to sufficient light. Maintenance rites dictated regular inspection of power levels, with depletion often interpreted symbolically as a sign of neglected duty rather than mere mechanical failure. Locomotion was achieved through anti-grav units mounted beneath or behind the skull. These units produced a controlled lift field, enabling stable hovering and precise movement through three-dimensional space. The technology was derived from established Imperial anti-grav principles, similar in concept to those used in servo harnesses and grav chutes, but scaled down and heavily stabilized. The resulting motion was characteristically smooth and deliberate, lacking the erratic adjustments associated with biological flight. This stability made Servo Skulls ideal for tasks requiring steady positioning, such as data recording, illumination, or the projection of Auspex fields. The sanctification process was as integral to construction as the mechanical assembly. Every Servo Skull underwent rites conducted by tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus, often in conjunction with members of the ecclesiarchy. These rites included the engraving of binharic canticles into internal components, the application of purity seals, and the recitation of prayers affirming the skull's role as an instrument of the Emperor's will. In many documented cases, fragments of scripture or identification codes were etched directly onto the bone or metal casing. This fusion of religious observance and engineering practice exemplified the Imperium's approach to technology as both sacred artifact and functional tool. The power source configuration also reflected this duality. While the physical mechanisms were purely technological, their operation was framed as the appeasement of machine spirits, rather than the execution of electrical processes. Maintenance manuals describe power cycling as a ritual act, accompanied by incense and prescribed chants. Failure to observe these rites was believed to result in diminished performance or erratic behavior, a belief reinforced by centuries of tradition even when mechanical explanations were sufficient. Over time, variations in construction emerged based on function. Some Servo Skulls were designed primarily for data storage and retrieval, carrying extensive memory banks within reinforced cranial vaults. Others emphasized sensory capabilities, with multiple optic arrays and Auspex nodes protruding from the skull in clustered formations. Inquisitorial records describe heavily modified examples equipped with weaponized attachments or defensive shielding, though such configurations were rare and required high-level authorization. Despite these variations, the core construction principles remained consistent, ensuring that a Servo Skull from one sector could be recognized and serviced by trained personnel elsewhere in the Imperium. The origins of Servo Skulls are inseparable from the Imperium's broader reliance on human-derived components and constrained automation. Their construction represents a compromise between the need for versatile, semi-autonomous tools and the absolute prohibition against true artificial intelligence. By anchoring these devices in human remains and ritualized processes, the Imperium reinforced ideological control while achieving practical functionality. The power sources that sustained them were modest yet reliable, designed to support long-term service rather than short bursts of high performance. In this balance of doctrine and engineering, Servo Skulls became enduring fixtures of Imperial life, drifting silently through archives, battlefields, and sanctums as persistent reminders of the Imperium's relationship with its own dead. Servo Skull specifications were never unified into a single Imperial pattern. Instead, they emerged as a broad class of sanctioned cybernetic constructs governed by minimum doctrinal and mechanical thresholds. Any device classified as a Servo Skull was required to conform to restrictions on cognition, autonomy, and armament, while allowing wide latitude in physical configuration depending on task, patron organization, and Forge world tradition. This variability explains why Servo Skulls appear across Imperial records in forms ranging from nearly unadorned cranial units to heavily augmented platforms bristling with sensors and ritual attachments. At baseline, the physical dimensions of a standard Servo Skull remained close to that of an unmodified human cranium. Average mass varied depending on internal equipment and external reinforcement, but most operational examples weighed between 3 and 6 kilograms once fully augmented. The skull structure itself was reinforced internally with plasteel struts or ceramite linings to compensate for the removal of natural bone density during preparation. This reinforcement allowed Servo Skulls to withstand minor impacts, environmental pressure changes, and prolonged exposure to radiation or vacuum, provided power and gravitic stabilization were maintained. Locomotion systems formed the most visually consistent component across patterns. Anti-grav units were compact, cylindrical or disc-shaped assemblies mounted beneath the occipital region or suspended on articulated struts behind the skull. These units generated lift sufficient to support the skull and all attached equipment, while maintaining a stable hover at variable heights. Standard operating altitude ranged from 0.5 meter to 2 meters above ground level, adjustable through pre-programmed parameters or external command signals. Maximum speed was limited by doctrinal safety margins. Most Servo Skulls moved no faster than a brisk walking pace when following personnel, though some Mechanicus survey variants were capable of higher transit speeds when operating independently in open environments. Directional control relied on microthrusters and gravitic field modulation rather than aerodynamic surfaces. This allowed precise maneuvering in confined spaces such as hive corridors, void ship maintenance shafts, and archive vaults. The motion profile was intentionally smooth, minimizing sudden accelerations that could interfere with pict recording or Auspex readings. Stabilization systems continuously corrected for recoil, vibration, or electromagnetic interference, ensuring consistent sensor alignment during operation. Sensory equipment constituted the core functional payload of most Servo Skulls. Optic systems replaced the natural eye sockets, though the exact configuration varied widely. The simplest models employed single-lens PIC recorders capable of capturing still images or continuous footage. These lenses were protected by armoured housings and could be fitted with adjustable apertures to accommodate variable lighting conditions. More advanced variants incorporated dual or multi-spectrum optics, enabling low-light amplification, infrared detection, and ultraviolet scanning. In some documented cases, additional optic stalks protruded from the cranial surface, providing overlapping fields of view for comprehensive environmental coverage. Auspex arrays expanded sensory capabilities beyond visual data. These arrays were typically embedded within the cranial cavity or mounted externally along the temporal or parietal regions. Common Auspex functions included motion detection, life sign scanning, radiation measurement, and atmospheric analysis. The resolution and range of these systems depended on power availability and intended use. Survey and reconnaissance Servo Skulls used by the Adeptus Mechanicus or Inquisition often carried more sophisticated Auspex packages than those assigned to clerical or ceremonial roles. Auditory sensors were less standardized but nonetheless prevalent. Vox pickups replaced or supplemented the natural auditory canals, allowing the Servo Skull to record ambient sound, isolate specific frequencies, or receive verbal commands. Some units were capable of basic voice recognition, though this function remained limited to pre-approved personnel identifiers. Output was handled through Vox emitters mounted in the jaw or lower cranial region. These emitters allowed Servo Skulls to relay pre-recorded messages, repeat spoken commands, or transmit alerts. Continuous speech generation was rare and tightly regulated, as it required additional cognitive processing capacity. Illumination tools were among the most common external attachments. Lumen globes or directional light emitters were affixed to the brow, jaw, or dorsal mounts, providing focused or diffuse lighting as required. These systems were particularly valuable in low-visibility environments such as underhives, void hulks, or battle-damaged structures. Intensity and beam width were adjustable within predefined limits, often controlled automatically in response to sensor input. Ecclesiarchal Servo Skulls frequently integrated lumens into halo-like frames, blending functional illumination with symbolic representation. Data handling equipment varied according to role. Archivist Servo Skulls carried memory wafers capable of storing vast quantities of textual, pict, and Auspex data. These wafers were shielded against electromagnetic interference and encoded using Mechanicus encryption protocols. Data ports were integrated discreetly into the cranial structure, allowing direct interface with cogitator banks, data slates or nospheric links. In some instances, Servo Skulls functioned as mobile data couriers, transporting sensitive information through environments where wireless transmission was unreliable or forbidden. Manipulation tools were less common but not unknown. Certain utility Servo Skulls were equipped with small mechadendrite arms or articulated probes. These appendages were capable of simple tasks such as activating switches, retrieving small objects, or positioning sensor equipment. Load-bearing capacity was minimal, reflecting the skull's limited mass and power reserves. More complex manipulation tasks remained the domain of full servitors or human operators. Defensive equipment was deliberately constrained. Imperial doctrine discouraged arming Servo Skulls beyond minimal self-protection, both to prevent misuse and to avoid blurring the distinction between tool and combatant. Nevertheless, some sanction variants included limited defensive measures. These could take the form of refractor field emitters providing brief energy shielding, or countermeasure systems designed to disrupt hostile Auspex targeting. Weaponized Servo Skulls were exceptionally rare and typically restricted to Inquisitorial use. Documented examples include skulls fitted with needle weapons, las pistols, or explosive charges, though such configurations required explicit authorization and were often classified. Power management governed every aspect of Servo Skull specification. Internal power cells were rated for long-duration operation, prioritizing efficiency over output. Average endurance ranged from several years to multiple decades depending on activity level and equipment load. High-demand functions such as continuous Auspex scanning or lumen projection accelerated depletion, necessitating periodic recharge or component replacement. Recharging was conducted through sanctified power couplings, often integrated into docking cradles within ships, fortresses, or temples. Some long-service skulls were designed for partial field maintenance, allowing power cell replacement without full disassembly. Environmental tolerances reflected the Imperium's operational realities. Servo Skulls were sealed against dust, moisture, and chemical contaminants. Many were rated for vacuum exposure and extreme temperature ranges, enabling deployment in void environments or hostile planetary conditions. Internal components were shock-mounted to mitigate damage from impacts or sudden pressure changes. Despite these protections, Servo Skulls were not indestructible. Sustained weapon fire, electromagnetic pulses, or direct physical trauma could disable or destroy them. Control systems balanced autonomy and oversight. Servo Skulls operated on pre-programmed behavioral routines, supplemented by limited adaptive responses. They could follow designated individuals, patrol defined routes, or maintain stationary observation points. Command inputs were received via Vox, data link, or nospheric interface depending on model. Overrides allowed authorized personnel to assume direct control or deactivate the unit if required. Failsafe protocols ensured that loss of command signal resulted in predictable behavior, such as returning to a designated point or entering a passive hover state. The cumulative effect of these specifications and tools positioned Servo Skulls as versatile support assets rather than primary actors. Their equipment suites emphasized observation, documentation, illumination, and data handling, reflecting their origins as extensions of Imperial bureaucracy and doctrine. While individual configurations varied widely, the underlying philosophy remained consistent. Servo Skulls were designed to observe, record, and assist, functioning as persistent mechanical witnesses embedded within the Imperium's vast and often hostile environments. Their tools and specifications embodied restraint as much as capability, ensuring utility without transgressing the ideological boundaries imposed by Imperial law. Servo Skulls possess no pilot in the conventional sense. They are not vehicles operated by an onboard human presence, nor are they remotely piloted in real time as a constant requirement. Instead, control is distributed across layered systems of limited cognition, pre-encoded command structures, and external authorization protocols. This distinction is fundamental to understanding their role within the Imperium, as it separates Servo Skulls from both manned constructs and forbidden autonomous intelligences. At the core of a Servo Skulls operation is a constrained logic engine. This component executes predefined behavioral routines rather than independent reasoning. These routines govern movement, task prioritization, sensor activation, and response thresholds. The logic engine does not interpret intent or context beyond narrow parameters. It follows instruction trees that were written during construction and modified only through sanctioned rites of recalibration. In this sense, the Servo Skull is closer to a mobile cogitator peripheral than a thinking entity. Oversight is typically assigned to a designated operator or authority rather than a pilot. For a Servo Skull attached to an Imperial official, that authority may be the individual themselves. Inquisitors, tech priests, senior officers, and members of the ecclesiarchy frequently carried Servo Skulls key to their personal identifiers. The skull would recognize vocal commands, nospheric signatures, or encrypted data pings from that individual and adjust its behavior accordingly. Commands remained simple and functional, such as positioning, recording, illumination activation, or data relay. Continuous manual control was unnecessary and in many cases discouraged, as it undermined the intended efficiency of the device. In institutional settings such as archives, manufactoria, or void ships, Servo Skulls were often assigned to systems rather than individuals. Command authority was embedded within local cogitator networks. In these cases, the skull operated as a mobile node, executing tasks based on schedules, alerts, or sensor triggers. A skull assigned to an archive might patrol aisles at set intervals, monitor environmental conditions, and record unauthorized access attempts. One assigned to a manufacturer could observe production lines, log output metrics, and flag deviations from acceptable tolerances. Human oversight existed, but it was supervisory rather than direct. The absence of a pilot also reflects theological considerations. The Imperium does not recognize Servo Skulls as vessels for living minds. While their construction uses human remains, canon sources emphasize that no consciousness is transferred or preserved. The skull is symbolic and functional, not a continuation of identity. Ecclesiarchal doctrine reinforces this separation, framing the skull as a sanctified tool animated by machine spirits rather than a bound soul. This distinction is repeated across Mechanicus catechisms and legal texts, serving to preempt accusations of necromancy or heretical mind preservation. The purpose of Servo Skulls evolved alongside the Imperium itself. Initially conceived as compact servitors for reconnaissance and data gathering during the Great Crusade, they filled a niche where full servitors were impractical. Their small size, stable locomotion, and low logistical burden made them ideal for exploration of confined or unstable environments. As the Imperium expanded and bureaucratic complexity increased, their role diversified. Servo Skulls became fixtures of administration, religion, warfare, and daily Imperial operations. One of their primary purposes is observation. Servo Skulls function as persistent witnesses, recording events, environments, and actions with impartial consistency. In legal proceedings, Pict and Auspex data recorded by Servo Skulls are often treated as authoritative evidence, particularly when human testimony is unreliable or unavailable. In military contexts, they document engagements, battlefield conditions, and troop movements. In religious settings, they record rites, sermons, and pilgrimages, preserving them for archival review or doctrinal verification. Illumination and guidance represent another core function. Servo Skulls frequently accompany personnel through dark or hazardous environments, providing stable light and navigational assistance. Their sensors allow them to detect structural instability, toxic atmospheres, or hostile movement, issuing alerts within the limits of their programming. In hive cities and void ships, where environmental failure is common, this role has saved countless lives, though such outcomes are rarely celebrated beyond internal reports. Data handling remains central to their purpose. As mobile data repositories, Servo Skulls bridge gaps between static archives and dynamic operational environments. They transport information through areas where transmission is restricted, insecure, or technologically degraded. Inquisitorial usage often emphasizes this role, with skulls carrying sealed data cores containing classified findings. The physical presence of the data, encoded and shielded, reduces the risk of interception compared to noospheric transmission. Symbolic and ceremonial purposes are equally significant. Within the ecclesiarchy, Servo Skulls serve as visible reminders of mortality, duty, and service beyond death. They accompany high-ranking clerics during processions, hover above altars, or illuminate relics. Their presence reinforces theological narratives that emphasize sacrifice and continuity. The use of human remains is not incidental, but intentional, aligning the machine with imperial reverence for the human form as sacred, even in death. In military service, Servo Skulls occupy a support role rather than a combat one. They scout ahead of advancing forces, monitor rear areas, and relay tactical data. Their limited defensive capabilities and lack of initiative prevent them from acting independently in battle. This limitation is deliberate, ensuring that responsibility for lethal action remains with sanctioned combatants. Even when fitted with weapons under rare authorization, their use is tightly constrained and documented. The purpose of Servo Skulls is also preventative. By maintaining constant observation and documentation, they deter unauthorized behavior. Their presence in archives, armories, and restricted zones serves as a reminder that actions are being recorded and may be reviewed. This passive enforcement function aligns with the Imperium's preference for omnipresent oversight, rather than reactive intervention. Servo Skulls are designed for longevity, not permanence. Their operational lifespan can extend for centuries, but degradation is inevitable. Power cells lose efficiency, logic engines suffer data corruption, and mechanical components wear despite ritual maintenance. When a Servo Skull's performance falls below acceptable thresholds, it is withdrawn from service. The manner of decommissioning depends on affiliation and circumstance. In the Adeptus Mechanicus, decommissioned Servo Skulls are often disassembled. Functional components are reclaimed, purified, and reused. The cranial shell may be reforged into other sanctioned devices or interred within Mechanicus ossuaries. The process is accompanied by rites acknowledging the completion of service and the release of the machine spirit. Records emphasize efficiency and continuity rather than sentiment. Within the ecclesiarchy, decommissioning takes on a more ceremonial character. Servo Skulls that have served in religious roles may be entombed within shrines or reliquaries. Some are fixed permanently into architectural features, becoming static icons rather than active devices. Others are returned to charnel houses or catacombs, where they are laid to rest among other sacred remains. The emphasis is on honouring service and reinforcing doctrinal symbolism. Inquisitorial Servo Skulls follow less standardised paths. Some are deliberately destroyed to prevent recovery of sensitive data. Others are sealed in vaults, their memory cores locked and preserved for potential future access. There are documented cases where inquisitorial skulls were abandoned in sealed locations, continuing to record long after their original purpose had lapsed, until power depletion ended their function. Such skulls, when rediscovered, have provided fragmented but valuable historical records. Loss in the field is common. Servo Skulls are destroyed by enemy action, environmental hazards, or simple neglect. In many cases, their destruction is unremarkable, noted only as a line item in logistics reports, yet even in destruction, they fulfill their purpose. Data recovered from damaged memory wafers has informed strategic decisions, exposed heresy, and clarified historical events long after the skull itself ceased to function. There are also instances where Servo Skulls persist beyond any known oversight. Forgotten in abandoned installations or drifting within derelict void ships, they continue to execute their last instructions until power failure or mechanical breakdown intervenes. These autonomous remnants are not truly independent, but they occupy a liminal state within Imperial records. They are neither active assets nor formally decommissioned. Their existence underscores the Imperium's scale and the inevitability of loss within its vast domains. The final fate of a Servo Skull is therefore not a single outcome but a range of conclusions shaped by function, affiliation, and circumstance. Some end in ritual honour, others in pragmatic reclamation, and many in silent destruction. What unifies these endings is the absence of personal legacy. Servo Skulls do not accumulate honorifics or memorials in the manner of human servants. Their service is continuous, anonymous, and expected. In this, Servo Skulls embody a core Imperial principle. They exist to serve, to observe, and to persist without recognition. They have no pilot to claim authorship of their actions, no purpose beyond assigned function, and no fate beyond eventual cessation. Yet through these limitations, they have become one of the Imperium's most enduring instruments. From the earliest expansions of mankind to the stagnant wars of the 41st millennium, Servo Skulls have hovered at the margins of history, recording it without comment and vanishing without ceremony once their task is complete. Adeptus Administratum records approach Servo Skulls not as symbols or curiosities, but as assets measured through compliance, efficiency, and continuity of function across centuries. The earliest Administratum impressions describe Servo Skulls as stabilizing instruments within an otherwise failure-prone bureaucratic environment. Their value was identified not in innovation, but in consistency. Where human clerks succumbed to fatigue, error, ideological deviation, or mortality, Servo Skulls persisted. This persistence shaped the Administratum's long-term assessment of their logistical worth. Administratum analytics categorize Servo Skulls as low-mass, low-maintenance auxiliary units with disproportionate returns in data reliability. Comparative reviews conducted across multiple sectors during the late Great Crusade period already noted reduced record degradation in facilities employing Servo Skull oversight. Picked capture verification reduced transcription disputes. Environmental Auspex monitoring reduced archival losses caused by humidity, fungal growth, and atmospheric instability. Over extended timelines, these marginal gains compounded into measurable preservation of Imperial knowledge. Administratum logisticians therefore came to regard Servo Skull deployment not as optional enhancement, but as infrastructural reinforcement. From a supply perspective, Servo Skulls presented a favourable logistical profile. Unlike full servitors, they required no life support systems, nutrient intake, or waste processing. Power consumption remained predictable and low. Replacement components followed standardized patterns across forge worlds aligned with Martian orthodoxy. Administratum shipping manifest frequently lists Servo Skull parts alongside lumen strips and data slate components, rather than alongside servitor flesh fats or penal population transfers. This classification reflects how the Administratum conceptualized them, closer to durable equipment than to labor assets. Attrition analytics further reinforced this view. Loss rates of Servo Skulls in non-combat environments were consistently low. When losses did occur, they were most often attributed to structural collapse, fire, or deliberate sabotage rather than internal failure. Administratum audits emphasize that even damaged Servo Skulls often yielded partial data recovery. Memory wafers, when recovered from debris, retained a significant percentage of stored information. This survivability elevated Servo Skulls in risk-adjusted planning models, particularly for long-term archival facilities and frontier administrative hubs. Administratum impressions also reflect ideological utility. Servo Skulls provided visible reinforcement of Imperial authority without the unpredictability of human enforcement. Their presence in record halls, tithe offices, and judicial chambers acted as passive compliance mechanisms. Internal behavioral studies note reduced incidents of falsified reports and unauthorized access attempts in environments monitored by Servo Skulls. The skull's form, combined with its unblinking observation, created a psychological deterrent effect that required no active intervention. Administratum analysis classified this as non-resource intensive compliance reinforcement. The Adeptus Mechanicus approached Servo Skull evaluation through a different lens. Mechanicus impressions focus on design orthodoxy, machine spirit stability, and manufacturability across forge networks. To the Mechanicus, Servo Skulls represent an optimal convergence of sanctified human material and constrained machine logic. They are cited repeatedly in Mechanicus treatises as exemplars of compliant automation. Their limited cognition places them safely below the threshold of abominable intelligence, while their functional autonomy surpasses simple cogitator nodes. Mechanicus analytics emphasize modularity. Servo Skull construction allows for standardized subassemblies combined with forge-specific embellishment. Anti-grav units, optic augmetics, power cells, and logic wafers are produced in batches and allocated according to need. This modular approach reduces manufacturing downtime and simplifies repair logistics. Forge World production reports indicate that Servo Skull assembly lines require significantly fewer specialist artisans than servitor fabrication facilities, allowing output scaling without proportional increases in skilled labour. Material sourcing also favoured Servo Skull production. The cranial component, while symbolically significant, did not require fresh biological material. Skulls could be drawn from existing ossuaries, battlefield remains, or sanctioned mortuary reserves. Mechanicus logisticians highlight this as a critical advantage during periods of population strain or mass casualty events. Where servitor production competed with manpower demands, Servo Skull manufacture utilised remains already accounted for within Imperial mortality systems. This reduced strain on living populations while maintaining production quotas. Machine spirit stability metrics consistently ranked Servo Skulls above more complex servitor patterns. Mechanicus maintenance logs show lower rates of erratic behaviour, logic drift, and catastrophic failure. The constrained logic engines used within Servo Skulls proved resistant to corruption and data fragmentation over time. This reliability is attributed to both limited processing scope and rigorous sanctification protocols. Mechanicus impressions often describe Servo Skull machine spirits as placid, obedient, and predictable, qualities highly valued within the cult Mechanicus. Logistical findings from joint Administratum and Mechanicus audits reveal a convergence of priorities. Both institutions identified Servo Skulls as force multipliers rather than replacements. Administratum deployment models show Servo Skulls extending the effective output of human clerks, overseers and officials by absorbing routine monitoring tasks. Mechanicus projections indicate that Servo Skulls reduce wear on larger systems by decentralizing data collection and environmental sensing. This alignment of benefits facilitated widespread institutional adoption. Transport analytics further reinforced their appeal. Servo Skulls occupy minimal cargo volume and mass. They can be transported in sealed crates, stasis racks, or even active escort configuration. Unlike servitors, they do not require sedation or restraint during transit. Administratum shipping records frequently list dozens of Servo Skulls per transport, alongside mundane supplies. Their transport flexibility allowed rapid redeployment in response to administrative restructuring, planetary compliance actions, or post-conflict reconstruction. The Adeptus Mechanicus also conducted long-term performance modelling. These projections assessed Servo Skull operational viability across centuries. Results consistently showed favourable lifespan to resource ratios. Even conservative estimates placed functional lifespans well beyond most human administrative careers. This temporal alignment mattered. Administratum planning cycles often span decades or centuries. Assets capable of matching those timelines without retraining or ideological drift were considered exceptionally valuable. Failure analytics provide further insight. When Servo Skulls failed, the causes were overwhelmingly external. Power depletion due to neglected maintenance, physical destruction, or environmental extremes accounted for the majority of losses. Internal logic collapse remained statistically insignificant. Mechanicus data interprets this as validation of design orthodoxy. The system does not fail itself. It fails only when abandoned or destroyed. Administratum impressions of these findings often adopt a tone of restrained approval. Servo Skulls are rarely praised in narrative reports, but their continued funding and expansion speak clearly. Budgetary allocations show steady increases in Servo Skull procurement during periods of administrative expansion. Conversely, reductions are rare and typically linked to broader austerity measures rather than dissatisfaction with performance. Joint analytics also address limitations. Both institutions acknowledge that Servo Skulls cannot replace human judgment. Administratum records caution against over-reliance on recorded data without contextual interpretation. Mechanicus treatises warn that expanding cognitive capacity risks doctrinal violation. These limitations are framed not as flaws, but as necessary boundaries. Servo Skulls function precisely because they do not exceed their mandate. There are also logistical findings related to social friction. Administratum surveys note occasional resistance from planetary populations unfamiliar with Servo Skull presence. Initial discomfort, superstition, or fear sometimes disrupted administrative operations. However, longitudinal studies show rapid normalization. Within 1 to 2 generations, Servo Skulls were integrated into local perceptions of Imperial authority. The Administratum interpreted this adaptability as further justification for continued deployment. From the Mechanicus perspective, Servo Skulls also serve as instructional platforms. Their simplicity allows them to function as training tools for junior tech adepts. Disassembly and maintenance of Servo Skulls are common rites within Mechanicus scholastic programs. This educational utility indirectly reduces logistical strain by increasing the pool of personnel capable of maintaining more complex systems. Analytics concerning resource efficiency conclude with a shared assessment. Servo Skulls offer sustained utility at minimal ongoing cost. They reduce error, extend institutional memory, and operate within doctrinal constraints. Their deployment scales effectively across worlds of varying development levels. Whether in a primitive shrine world archive or a high-output forge complex, Servo Skulls adapt without requiring environmental transformation. In aggregate, Adeptus Administratum and Adeptus Mechanicus impressions converge on a single functional conclusion. Servo Skulls are not remarkable because of innovation or power. They are remarkable because they endure. They persist within systems defined by decay, loss, and human limitation. Their logistical profile aligns with the Imperium's central challenge, the management of vast scale over impossible time. Through consistent performance, predictable maintenance, and doctrinal compliance, Servo Skulls have earned their position as silent infrastructure within Imperial governance. They are not celebrated, but they are relied upon. Training and manufacturing practices surrounding Servo Skulls reflect a convergence of institutional pragmatism and doctrinal constraint. Unlike many Imperial technologies whose creation is guarded by extreme secrecy or limited to a handful of forge worlds, Servo Skull production is widespread, standardized at the core, and adaptable at the margins. This accessibility is not accidental. It is the result of deliberate decisions by the Adeptus Mechanicus and endorsed through Administratum procurement policy, ensuring that Servo Skulls could be produced, maintained, and deployed across the Imperium without creating dependency bottlenecks. Manufacturing begins within Mechanicus-controlled facilities, most commonly secondary manufactoria, rather than primary forge complexes. Servo Skull production does not require the heaviest industrial infrastructure, nor does it demand the highest grade materials reserved for war engines or voidcraft. This allows production to occur on forge worlds, shrine worlds with Mechanicus enclaves, and even compliant industrial worlds operating under Martian oversight. The decentralization of manufacture is a recurring theme in Mechanicus logistics reports, cited as a resilience measure against supply disruption. The cranial component enters the manufacturing cycle already categorized and sanctified. Skulls are sorted by size, structural integrity, and prior designation. Those drawn from honored Imperial dead are often reserved for ecclesiastical or ceremonial use cases, while anonymous or penal origin skulls are allocated to administrative or industrial roles. The distinction is not functional in a mechanical sense, but it remains culturally and doctrinally significant. Mechanicus records emphasize that improper allocation constitutes a violation of right rather than a technical error. Once received, skulls undergo mechanical preparation. Bone density is assessed, then reinforced internally using ceramite linings or plasteel lattices. Cavities are reshaped with precision cutting tools to accommodate logic wafers, power units, and data conduits. This stage is conducted by mid-ranking tech adepts rather than senior magi, reflecting the routine nature of the work. The procedures are codified, taught, and repeatable, forming a foundational component of Mechanicus technical education. Training for servo skull manufacture is embedded early within Mechanicus scholastic pathways. Junior tech adepts are introduced to servo skull assembly as part of their instruction in compliant automation. The device serves as a teaching model for multiple disciplines. Structural reinforcement teaches material science. Logic engine installation teaches the limits of sanctioned cognition. Anti-grav calibration introduces gravitic theory at a manageable scale. Rites of sanctification reinforce theological orthodoxy. This makes servo skulls uniquely valuable as instructional tools, bridging theory and applied practice without exposing trainees to prohibited technologies. The installation of logic engines is tightly supervised. While the components themselves are mass-produced, their calibration requires adherence to strict parameters. Processing thresholds are deliberately capped. Memory allocation is limited according to intended function. Adaptive routines are constrained to prevent emergent behavior. Mechanicus training manuals stress repetition and verification during this phase, with multiple checks conducted by separate adepts. Errors here are not treated lightly. A misconfigured logic engine risks classification as heretical, regardless of intent. Power systems and anti-grav units are installed next. These components are largely standardized, allowing interchangeability across production sites. Anti-grav calibration is performed in controlled chambers, where hover stability, altitude variance, and directional responsiveness are measured against acceptable tolerances. Units failing to meet specifications are disassembled rather than repaired, as component-level remediation is deemed inefficient for this class of device. This discard-and-replace approach appears frequently in mechanics analytics and reflects the Imperium's preference for predictability over optimization. Sanctification rites conclude the manufacturing process. These rites are not uniform in wording but are uniform in intent. They affirm the machine spirit's obedience, designate the skull's function, and bind its operational identity to Imperial authority. Administratum observers have noted that while these rites appear ceremonial, they also serve a practical role. They mark the point at which the servo skull enters official inventories and becomes subject to tracking, assignment, and audit. Recorded use cases for servo skulls span nearly every institutional domain of the Imperium. Administratum archives provide extensive documentation of deployment in bureaucratic environments. In record vaults, servo skulls patrol aisles, monitor humidity and atmospheric composition, and record access activity. Their presence reduces reliance on human guards for low-risk oversight tasks. In tithe offices, skulls record transactions and ensure compliance with prescribed measurement protocols. Discrepancies flagged by servo skull data are frequently cited in audit proceedings. In industrial contexts, particularly those overseen by the Adeptus Mechanicus, servo skulls serve as mobile diagnostic platforms. They monitor machine output, detect deviations in vibration or thermal patterns, and record maintenance cycles. Their limited manipulation capabilities allow them to interact with control interfaces or position sensors, though they do not perform repairs. Mechanicus reports highlight their value in hazardous environments where prolonged human presence is inefficient or unsafe. Military use cases are documented extensively, though always in support roles. Servo skulls accompany command staff, recording engagements and relaying situational data. They scout ahead of advancing units, particularly in confined environments such as hive interiors or void chip corridors. Their small size and stable flight profile make them difficult to detect compared to larger drones. However, their vulnerability limits their deployment to reconnaissance, rather than sustained observation in high-threat zones. Ecclesiarchal use cases emphasize symbolism and ritual continuity. Servo skulls illuminate altars, hover above relics, and accompany processions. They record sermons and rites for doctrinal review, ensuring consistency across distant shrine worlds. In missionary contexts, skulls document conversion efforts, recording evidence of compliance or resistance. These records are later reviewed by higher authorities to assess the success of ecclesiastical campaigns. Inquisitorial use cases, while fewer in number, are among the most intensively documented. Servo Skulls assigned to Inquisitors are often customized, equipped with enhanced Auspex suites and encrypted data cores. They accompany investigations, recording testimony, scanning environments for anomalies, and transporting sealed data. Some skulls are tasked with independent observation, positioned in strategic locations to monitor suspected heretical activity over extended periods. Inquisitorial records emphasize redundancy, with multiple skulls assigned overlapping observation tasks to ensure data integrity. Notable recorded use cases include Servo Skull deployment during compliance actions against recalcitrant worlds. Administratum after-action reports note that Skull recorded evidence of non-compliance simplified post-conflict legal proceedings, rather than relying on human testimony, which was often compromised by fear or coercion. Pict and Auspex data provided objective records. This reduced administrative delays and expedited the integration of newly compliant worlds into Imperial systems. Another significant use case appears in exploration and recovery operations. Servo Skulls are deployed into unstable ruins, derelict void ships, and xenotech-infested zones. Their expendability relative to human personnel makes them ideal for initial reconnaissance. Mechanicus recovery logs show that Servo Skulls frequently provide the first confirmed data on hazardous sites, guiding subsequent human or servitor deployment. Notable figures associated with Servo Skull use are rarely celebrated in narrative histories, but their records reveal patterns of reliance. Inquisitors of the Ordo Hereticus and Ordo Xenos frequently appear alongside references to customized Servo Skulls key to their authority. These skulls are described as extensions of investigative process rather than personal companions. Their names, when recorded, are functional identifiers rather than honorific titles. High-ranking tech priests are also associated with distinctive Servo Skull usage. Magi overseeing large manufactoria often deploy multiple skulls simultaneously, each assigned to different monitoring tasks. Mechanicus logs attribute improved output stability to this practice. The skulls act as distributed sensory networks, feeding data into central cogitators for analysis. High-ranking tech priests are also associated with distinctive Servo Skull usage. Magi overseeing large manufactoria often deploy multiple skulls simultaneously, each assigned to different monitoring tasks. Mechanicus logs attribute improved output stability to this practice. The skulls act as distributed sensory networks, feeding data into central cogitators for analysis. Within the ecclesiarchy, cardinals and confessors are often accompanied by ceremonial Servo Skulls, whose provenance is carefully documented. These skulls sometimes originate from revered martyrs or former clerics. While their function remains largely symbolic, their presence is meticulously recorded, underscoring the importance of lineage and continuity within ecclesiastical structures. There are also records of planetary governors employing Servo Skulls as tools of oversight. In these cases, skulls monitor court proceedings, administrative offices, and public assemblies. Administratum reviews suggest that such use correlates with reduced corruption metrics, though causation remains debated. The skulls provide records, not enforcement, but their presence alters behavior in measurable ways. Training records note that some individuals develop familiarity with Servo Skull operation beyond basic command. Administratum clerks, junior officers, and tech adepts often receive instruction in issuing standardized commands, interpreting skull-collected data, and conducting minor maintenance rites. This training is practical rather than specialized, reinforcing the skull's role as an integrated tool rather than a specialized asset. Across these recorded use cases and associations, a consistent theme emerges. Servo Skulls are embedded within systems, not personalities. They are assigned, reassigned, and replaced without ceremony. Even when linked to notable figures, their identity remains subordinate to function. Their training and manufacture emphasize repeatability and compliance. Their use cases prioritize documentation, oversight, and continuity. Their association with authority is structural rather than personal. The Adeptus Administratum and Adeptus Mechanicus do not frame Servo Skulls as remarkable machines. They frame them as dependable processes made manifest, trained into existence, manufactured at scale, deployed without fanfare and recorded without embellishment. Servo Skulls serve as connective tissue between institutions, individuals, and centuries. They are present wherever the Imperium requires memory without interpretation and observation without judgment. From the combined perspective of the Adeptus Administratum and the Adeptus Mechanicus, Servo Skulls are evaluated less as individual devices and more as systemic instruments. Their benefits, costs, and overall value are assessed through aggregated performance across decades or centuries rather than through isolated effectiveness. This long-view analysis shapes the final institutional judgment of their role within Imperial infrastructure. The primary benefit identified by the Adeptus Administratum is continuity. Servo Skulls provide uninterrupted observational and recording capacity in systems defined by personnel turnover, generational decay, and administrative overload. Clerks retire or die. Governors are replaced. Departments are restructured or purged. Servo Skulls persist through these changes without loss of procedural memory. Administratum analytics consistently show that offices equipped with Servo Skull oversight retain higher data integrity across transitional periods. Records remain consistent despite personnel flux. This continuity reduces revalidation labour, a non-trivial burden within Imperial bureaucracy. A secondary benefit is error reduction. Servo Skulls do not eliminate human error, but they constrain it. By recording transactions, proceedings, and environmental conditions, they introduce verifiable reference points into systems otherwise dependent on manual transcription and memory. Administratum audits frequently cite Servo Skull data when resolving disputes between departments or officials. Even when the Skull's data is incomplete, its presence narrows the range of plausible error. This constraint improves administrative throughput by reducing prolonged investigation cycles. The psychological effect of Servo Skull deployment is also categorized as a benefit. Administratum behavioral studies, though cautious in tone, note measurable changes in compliance behavior within monitored environments. The Skull's constant presence produces a passive enforcement effect without requiring additional manpower. Importantly, this effect does not escalate confrontations. Servo Skulls observe without intervening, allowing authority to remain abstract and omnipresent rather than personalized. This aligns with Administratum doctrine, which favors systemic control over individual enforcement. From the Adeptus Mechanicus perspective, the primary benefit lies in doctrinally compliant automation. Servo Skulls demonstrate that useful autonomy can exist without violating prohibitions against abominable intelligence. Mechanicus treatises frequently reference Servo Skulls as proof that constrained logic engines, when properly sanctified and limited, can outperform purely passive systems. This validation supports broader Mechanicus arguments for sanctioned automation within strict bounds. Reliability is another critical benefit emphasized by the Mechanicus. Servo Skull failure rates, when isolated from external destruction, remain exceptionally low. Longitudinal maintenance records show stable performance across extended operational periods. Machine spirit appeasement cycles remain predictable. Logic drift is rare. These qualities reduce the need for constant recalibration and inspection, freeing Mechanicus labor for higher priority systems. In resource allocation models, Servo Skulls consistently rank as low-maintenance assets with high uptime. Modularity further enhances their value. Servo Skull components are interchangeable across patterns and production sites. This simplifies supply chains and allows damaged units to be restored quickly using reclaimed parts. Mechanicus logistics analyses highlight this as a key advantage in frontier zones where access to full manufactoria is limited. A Servo Skull can be kept operational with minimal infrastructure, extending its utility far beyond core worlds. Cost analysis provides a counterbalance to these benefits. While servo skulls are less expensive than full servitors, they are not negligible expenditures. The manufacturing process requires skilled labour, sanctified components, and adherence to ritual protocols that consume time and resources. Administratum budgets reflect these costs explicitly. Servo skull procurement is planned, justified, and tracked. Unlike expendable equipment, skulls are treated as capital assets expected to deliver value over extended periods. The cost of maintenance, while low per unit, accumulates at scale. Large administratum complexes and forge worlds may employ hundreds or thousands of servo skulls. Each requires periodic inspection, power management, and ritual servicing. Administratum cost models account for this by distributing maintenance responsibility across existing personnel rather than creating dedicated skull servicing departments. This approach minimizes visible overhead, but increases baseline workload for clerks and tech adepts. Opportunity cost is also considered. Resources allocated to servo skull production could, in theory, be diverted to other assets. Administratum analyses occasionally question whether additional human clerks or upgraded static cogitators might achieve similar outcomes. However, comparative studies repeatedly conclude that servo skulls outperform these alternatives when evaluated across multi-decade timelines. Humans require training, supervision, and replacement. Static systems lack mobility and contextual coverage. Servo skulls occupy a niche that neither alternative fills efficiently. The Adeptus Mechanicus similarly evaluates cost through the lens of risk. Servo skulls pose minimal ideological risk when properly configured. Their constrained cognition reduces the probability of doctrinal breach. This lowers the cost of oversight compared to more complex systems. Mechanicus risk models favour technologies whose failure modes are predictable and non-catastrophic. Servo skulls typically fail by cessation rather than escalation. They stop functioning rather than behaving unpredictably. This characteristic significantly reduces downstream costs associated with investigation, purge, or containment. Joint Administratum and Mechanicus analyses also consider scalability. Servo skull deployment scales linearly rather than exponentially. Adding additional skulls increases capability without introducing complex interdependencies. This simplicity is highly valued in Imperial systems, where cascading failures are a constant concern. Servo skull networks do not form emergent behaviours. They operate independently or report to centralised systems without lateral coordination. This architectural simplicity reduces systemic fragility. There are acknowledged limitations that temper final assessments. Servo skulls cannot interpret context or intent beyond programmed parameters. They cannot replace human judgment in complex administrative or investigative decisions. Administratum guidance explicitly warns against treating skull-recorded data as self-sufficient truth. Interpretation remains a human responsibility. Mechanicus doctrine reinforces this boundary, emphasizing that expanding cognitive capacity undermines the very compliance that makes servo skulls acceptable. Despite these limitations, final analysis from both institutions converges on a shared conclusion. Servo skulls represent an optimal balance between utility, cost, and doctrinal safety. They are not transformative technologies. They do not accelerate progress or redefine capability. Instead, they stabilize existing systems. They preserve function in environments where decay is the norm. Administratum final reports often summarize servo skull value in understated terms. They reduce workload variance, they improve record fidelity, they lower long-term administrative risk. These outcomes, while unremarkable individually, accumulate into significant systemic resilience. The Imperium does not reward efficiency with recognition, but it depends upon it for survival. The Adeptus Mechanicus reaches a parallel conclusion framed in theological language. Servo skulls honour the sanctity of the human form, respect the boundaries of machine intelligence, and fulfill their purpose without deviation. They are compliant tools that endure. Their continued deployment is therefore not merely justified, but expected. From this dual perspective, servo skulls are neither excess nor indulgence. They are infrastructure. Their benefits outweigh their costs not because they excel, but because they persist. In an Imperium defined by attrition, that persistence is sufficient. Inquisition impressions of Servo Skulls diverge subtly but decisively from those of the Adeptus Administratum and the Adeptus Mechanicus. Where those institutions assess efficiency, compliance, and doctrinal safety, the Inquisition approaches Servo Skulls as potential variables. Their assessments are not dismissive but cautious, shaped by the Ordo's mandate to identify deviation before it manifests as catastrophe. As a result, Inquisitorial records frame Servo Skulls not merely as tools, but as persistent observers whose long operational lives intersect with secrecy, memory erosion, and unintended accumulation of data. Early Inquisition commentaries note that Servo Skulls occupy an unusual epistemic position. They record without intent, yet their recordings can outlast both the events observed and the authorities that sanctioned them. This persistence creates archival layers that may not align with current doctrine or political reality. Inquisitorial analysts frequently emphasize that a Servo Skull does not forget, reinterpret, or forgive. It preserves. In a system where truth is often recontextualized, this preservation is treated as both asset and liability. Observational logs compiled by the Order Hereticus highlight Servo Skull behavior during investigations. Skull-recorded pict feeds are valued for their neutrality, yet investigators note a recurring issue. Servo Skulls record everything within their parameters, including procedural missteps, unauthorized improvisations, and moments of doctrinal ambiguity by Imperial agents themselves. Several sealed case notes remark that Servo Skull data has, on occasion, implicated Imperial officials as readily as suspected heretics. This impartiality complicates their use. Some Inquisitors restrict skull recording ranges or selectively disable functions during sensitive phases of inquiry. Such actions are recorded reluctantly and often accompanied by written justification. The Ordo Xenos offers a different observational emphasis. In frontier and Xeno contact zones, Servo Skulls are deployed extensively for reconnaissance and monitoring. Inquisitorial impressions acknowledge their utility, but also note anomalies in long-duration exposure to alien environments and technologies. In multiple classified reports, Servo Skulls operating near Xenos artifacts exhibited unexplained data corruption. Recorded pict feeds showed visual distortion not attributable to environmental interference. Auspex logs registered fluctuations inconsistent with known physics. While no conclusive causal link was established, Inquisitorial analysts flagged these incidents as unresolved variables rather than mechanical failures. Observations from the Ordo Malleus introduce a more contentious dimension. Servo Skulls deployed in warp-adjacent environments, demon-infested sites, or locations of significant psychic residue have produced records that defy standard interpretation. In several instances, Skulls continued recording despite conditions that should have disabled their power systems. Timestamps desynchronized. Vox logs captured frequencies outside sanctioned auditory ranges. These findings are described without embellishment in sealed reports, often followed by cautious annotations stating that the data remains unverified and potentially compromised. One recurring observation concerns spatial inconsistency. Servo Skull pict feeds recovered from certain warp-tainted locations display architectural features that do not correspond to physical measurements taken later by human teams. Corridors appear elongated. Angles deviate subtly from Euclidean norms. These discrepancies persist across multiple frames and recording cycles. Mechanicus consultants attributed some cases to Auspex miscalibration or logic stack degradation. Inquisition analysts did not reject these explanations but noted that recalibrated skulls deployed subsequently recorded similar distortions in the same locations. Another category of observation relates to behavioral persistence beyond command loss. In standard doctrine, servo skulls deprived of command signals enter passive states or return to predefined locations. However, Inquisitorial archives contain a limited number of reports describing skulls that continue to patrol, observe, or reposition themselves despite the confirmed absence of active command authority. These incidents are rare and heavily scrutinized. In each case, investigators confirmed that no expanded cognition was present. The skulls followed existing routines, yet the triggers for those routines could not be conclusively identified. One frequently cited case involved a Servo Skull assigned to monitor a sealed archive wing following an Inquisitorial purge. After the facility was abandoned and power systems degraded, the skull continued to activate intermittently for decades, recording empty corridors and static air. The recordings showed no deviation in behavior, yet the continued operation exceeded projected power endurance by a significant margin. No auxiliary power source was identified. The final report classified the incident as an unresolved anomaly, noting that the skull was eventually destroyed to prevent further uncertainty. Inquisitorial impressions also address the cumulative effect of data layering. Servo Skulls assigned to long-term observation accumulate records that span multiple regimes, doctrines, and interpretations. When such skulls are recovered intact, their archives may contain contradictions. Events later declared heretical may appear unremarkable in earlier recordings. Individuals posthumously condemned may be recorded performing sanctioned duties without deviation. The Inquisition recognizes this as a structural tension. Servo Skulls preserve what occurred, not what was later decided to have occurred. This has led to divergent practices within the Inquisition. Some ordos value Servo Skull data precisely because it predates doctrinal revision. Others view such data as dangerous without proper contextual framing. There are documented instances where skull memory wafers were deliberately fragmented, with only selected segments preserved for analysis. The remainder was destroyed to prevent uncontrolled dissemination of inconvenient records. These actions are justified in marginal notes as containment rather than censorship. Unexplainable findings occupy a distinct section within Inquisitorial archives. These findings are not presented as proof of sentience or possession, but they resist straightforward classification. One such finding involves repeated low-level Vox emissions detected from inactive Servo Skulls stored in null environments. The emissions did not resolve into coherent speech or code. Frequency analysis showed no pattern matching known Imperial signals. Mechanicus examination found no active Vox components. The reports conclude without hypothesis, merely recording the phenomenon and sealing the skulls involved. Another category involves temporal irregularity. In several sealed cases, Servo Skull recordings include frames or data packets time-stamped outside expected chronological order. These anomalies occur without corresponding evidence of cogitator malfunction. Human operators reviewing the data reported no perceptual effects, yet the timestamps persisted across multiple review systems. The Inquisition categorized these incidents as non-actionable anomalies, but retained the data for future correlation. Psychological observations are also recorded, though cautiously. Inquisitorial field notes mention that some personnel develop unease when operating alongside Servo Skulls in prolonged investigations. This unease is not attributed to fear of the skulls themselves, but to their persistence. Investigators report heightened awareness of being recorded, even when skull functions are known to be limited. In some cases, personnel anthropomorphize skulls despite training to the contrary. The Inquisition does not interpret this as evidence of skull influence, but as a human response to constant observation. There are rare reports of Servo Skulls recovered from ancient sites, exhibiting modifications inconsistent with current Mechanicus standards. These skulls display archaic logic inscriptions, obsolete gravitic housings, or hybridized components no longer in use. Their behavior remains compliant, yet their internal architecture resists full analysis due to missing reference frameworks. The Inquisition treats these finds as historical artifacts rather than active threats, but notes the difficulty in verifying their complete function. Inquisitorial impressions consistently emphasize restraint in interpretation. While anomalies are recorded, they are not extrapolated into doctrine. Servo Skulls are not classified as unstable or suspect by default. Instead, they are treated as instruments whose long operational timelines expose them to environments and conditions beyond original design assumptions. The Inquisition views these edge cases as reminders of systemic limits rather than evidence of inherent corruption. Observations also note that Servo Skulls, by virtue of their design, cannot contextualize what they record. This creates gaps between observation and meaning. Inquisitors reviewing skull data must impose interpretation externally. Errors arise not from the skull, but from human misreading. Several internal memoranda caution against overinterpreting anomalous data without corroboration. The skull records phenomena. It does not explain them. Despite these cautions, Servo Skulls remain embedded in Inquisitorial operations. Their utility outweighs unresolved concerns. They provide documentation in environments where witnesses cannot survive. They persist where human memory fails. They record events that would otherwise vanish into rumour or denial. The Inquisition accepts the risks inherent in this persistence, preferring known variables to absence of data. The final impression conveyed in Chapter 3, Part 1 is not suspicion but vigilance. Servo Skulls are not treated as trusted companions, nor as threats requiring suppression. They are regarded as instruments whose silence is both strength and vulnerability. They do not lie, but they also do not explain. Their records may reveal truths that institutions are unprepared to confront. For the Inquisition, this makes Servo Skulls neither benign nor dangerous, but consequential. In this perspective, Servo Skulls are reminders that observation itself carries weight. They endure long enough to outlive certainty. They accumulate evidence without intent. They expose the tension between what is recorded and what is sanctioned to be remembered. The Inquisition does not resolve this tension. It documents it, seals it, and moves on, aware that the skulls will continue hovering, recording, and persisting long after the current investigation has concluded. Under Inquisitorial seal, the terminal disposition of Servo Skulls is never recorded as a single unified outcome. The Imperium does not retire such instruments in a ceremonial or conclusive manner. Instead, they pass through layers of administrative erosion until they either cease to function, are repurposed beyond original designation, or are deliberately erased from record. Inquisition files treat the final fate of a Servo Skull not as an endpoint, but as a condition of relevance. Once a unit no longer produces actionable intelligence, performs a sanctioned task, or represents a variable of concern, it is functionally dead, regardless of whether it continues to operate. Inquisitorial archives indicate that the most common terminal classification applied to Servo Skulls is silent continuation. These units remain active within Imperial infrastructure for centuries, outliving the offices, individuals, and even worlds that first commissioned them. Their logic cores degrade gradually, data crystal lattices fragment, and behavioral subroutines simplify over time. What remains is often a hovering relic capable of only the most rudimentary functions: illumination, path following, or repetitive vocalization of obsolete phrases. Such units are rarely decommissioned. The Inquisition notes that deactivation requires intention, effort, and justification, while neglect requires none. As a result, countless Servo Skulls persist in cathedra vaults, Administratum stacks, void ship corridors, and sealed archives, performing tasks whose original purpose has been forgotten by all living authorities. More troubling are cases in which a Servo Skull's operational lifespan exceeds the lifespan of its controlling oversight. Inquisitorial observations describe units that continue to record, catalogue, or transmit data long after their assigned recipient has perished or their communication node has collapsed. In some instances, these Servo Skulls adapt by defaulting to secondary protocols, redirecting their output to the nearest available data shrine or noospheric relay. In other cases, the data accumulates internally, unreviewed, forming dense memory strata of unprocessed information. The Ordo Hereticus considers such accumulation a latent threat, not because of what the data contains, but because of what may eventually access it. A Servo Skull that has silently observed decades of administrative procedure, security routines, or classified deliberation becomes, in inquisitorial terms, an unsecured witness. A smaller subset of records addresses deliberate termination. These cases are almost exclusively associated with contamination events, suspected scrap code exposure, or proximity to prescribed phenomena. The standard procedure involves immediate isolation, followed by either sanctified dismantling under Mechanicus supervision or complete incineration. Inquisitorial marginalia repeatedly emphasize that destruction is preferable to investigation when anomalous behavior intersects with warp-tainted environments. Servo Skulls recovered from demon incursions, nullfield collapses, or post-exterminatus ruins are rarely studied in depth. The risk of mimetic corruption or lingering empiric resonance is judged to outweigh any potential intelligence value. As one sealed notation states, a device that has looked upon the unreal cannot be trusted to remember reality correctly. Despite this, there exist sealed reports describing servo skulls that were neither destroyed nor decommissioned, but deliberately sealed away. These units are confined within stasis reliquaries or null coffins, suspended indefinitely. The stated justification is inconsistency. In these cases, the servo skull did not exhibit overt hostility, heretical output, or mechanical failure, but behaved in ways that could not be reconciled with known programming logic. Examples include units that altered patrol routes without environmental stimulus, recorded events that did not occur according to corroborated sources, or responded to individuals who were not physically present. Inquisitorial doctrine treats inconsistency as more dangerous than error. An error can be corrected, inconsistency suggests an unknown influence. The Inquisition's internal analysis acknowledges a structural problem in determining final fate. Servo skulls occupy a conceptual blind spot between object and remnant. They are not servitors in the traditional sense, lacking a living biological substrate, and thus evade many of the safeguards applied to lobotomized labor units. They are not cogitators, and therefore bypass numerous data purity audits. They are not relics despite their human origin, and so are rarely venerated or ritually reviewed. The question of purpose is revisited repeatedly in inquisitorial analysis, not to reaffirm official doctrine, but to assess drift. Servo skulls were created to serve as extensions of Imperial will, to see, to carry, to record, and to obey. Over time, however, the Inquisition observes a gradual divergence between intended purpose and functional reality. Units originally commissioned for narrow tasks accumulate additional responsibilities through ad hoc reprogramming. A courier skull becomes a surveillance platform. A record keeper becomes a mobile witness. A decorative reliquary acquires data-gathering augmetics because the capability is available. This accretion of function is not centrally tracked. As a result, servo skulls frequently perform roles beyond their authorization, not through rebellion, but through bureaucratic neglect. Several sealed conclave discussions question whether servo skulls, taken collectively, constitute an informal distributed sensor network across the Imperium. The theory is not officially endorsed, but appears repeatedly in cross-ordo correspondence. The premise is simple: millions of semi-autonomous devices equipped with optical and auditory sensors present in nearly every Imperial institution, recording fragments of reality without centralized oversight. The Inquisition does not claim that this network is coordinated, only that it exists. The final fate of any individual servo skull in this view is irrelevant. What matters is the cumulative persistence of the system. Destruction of a single unit removes a node, but does not diminish the overall presence. Inquisitorial efforts to impose terminal accounting on servo skulls have historically failed. Attempts to mandate periodic audits encounter resistance from both the Adeptus Mechanicus, who regard such oversight as an intrusion into sacred technology, and the Adeptus Administratum, which lacks the logistical capacity to track devices that are often undocumented to begin with. The Inquisition itself acknowledges that enforcing decommissioning protocols would require more resources than tolerating ambiguity. Thus, final fate remains largely theoretical. Servo skulls end when they stop functioning, when they are destroyed by circumstance, or when they become inconvenient enough to warrant attention. A particularly restricted set of documents addresses the fate of servo skulls derived from notable individuals. While official doctrine claims that origin skulls are selected based on availability and suitability rather than status, Inquisitorial investigations confirm that remains of historically significant figures are sometimes converted into servo skulls under exceptional circumstances. The final fate of such units is almost always suppression. Once their symbolic value outweighs their utility, they are withdrawn from service and sealed. The concern is not reverence, but distortion. A servo skull bearing the remains of a celebrated commander or saint risks being interpreted as a relic, regardless of its function. The Inquisition views this as a destabilizing variable within Imperial faith structures. In cases where servo skulls are captured or examined by external forces, particularly during conflicts involving Heretic factions or Xenos entities, their fate becomes a matter of strategic denial. Inquisitorial orders consistently prioritize destruction over recovery if there is a risk that internal data or construction principles could be reverse engineered. Servo skulls recovered from Dark Mechanicum enclaves show signs of extensive modification, including integration with warp-reactive materials and non-human logic architectures. These units are never reintegrated. Their final fate is immediate annihilation, followed by data-purging rites performed on any personnel who interacted with them. The most unresolved category concerns servo skulls that vanish. Inquisitorial loss reports document units that cease transmission, fail to return to docking stations, or disappear during warp transit without trace. While many such losses are attributed to mundane causes, a non-trivial number remain unexplained. In these cases, final fate is listed as indeterminate. The Inquisition does not speculate officially on whether such units are destroyed, captured, or continue to operate beyond Imperial awareness. However, the recurrence of these losses, particularly along unstable warp routes and frontier zones, is noted with concern. In closing assessments, Inquisitorial analysts refrain from issuing a definitive judgment on servo skulls as a class of technology. They are described instead as symptomatic. Servo skulls reflect the Imperium's reliance on continuity over clarity, persistence over precision. Their final fate is rarely planned because the Imperium itself does not plan endings well. It plans survival. As long as a servo skull continues to function within acceptable parameters, it is permitted to exist. When it does not, it is erased, sealed, or forgotten. The last recorded consensus within sealed Inquisition memoranda states that servo skulls should not be understood as tools with life cycle, but as artifacts of an ongoing process. They are born from death, sustained by neglect, and terminated by inconvenience. Their ultimate fate is not destruction or deactivation, but absorption into the background machinery of the Imperium, where they hover, observe, and endure until the moment they are noticed again. The most restricted inquisitorial material concerning servo skulls does not describe them as devices to be evaluated, but as records to be contained. Classified files at the highest clearance levels rarely focus on individual units. Instead, they address patterns of presence, recurrence, and institutional dependence. Servo skulls appear in these documents not as anomalies themselves, but as consistent background elements in nearly every investigation, regardless of sector, ordo, or threat classification. This ubiquity is not framed as intentional design. It is treated as an emergent condition of Imperial operation. Sealed cross-ordo compilations reveal that servo skulls are disproportionately represented in environments later subjected to inquisitorial sanction. They are present during compliance audits, heresy trials, data purges, and containment operations with a frequency that exceeds statistical expectation when compared to other forms of auxiliary technology. Analysts note that servo skulls are often the only non-human witnesses to events that later require reconstruction. Their recordings, when they exist, are fragmentary, often corrupted, and rarely decisive. Yet their presence is constant enough that the Inquisition has come to treat them as environmental fixtures rather than deliberate observers. Classified commentary describes this as informational sediment, layers of partial perception accumulating without central intent. Several locked files concern servo skulls that appear across multiple investigations separated by time and location. These are not described as confirmed identifications, but as probable continuity based on matching augmetic configurations, damage patterns, and behavioral quirks. In some cases, a servo skull recorded in a Hive-World Administratum vault is later noted aboard a void ship centuries later, performing an unrelated task. The files do not accuse the units of autonomy. Instead, they document a lack of traceable transfer authority. No shipping orders, reassignment writs, or Mechanicus logs explain the transition. The Inquisition classifies these movements as administratively invisible. The skulls move because someone moved them, but the act left no durable record. A subset of classified material addresses servo skulls recovered after events involving temporal distortion, warp anomalies, or reality degradation. These files are heavily redacted, but consistent elements remain. Servo skulls exposed to such conditions often retain recordings that do not align with linear chronology. Timestamps loop, overlap, or reference intervals that cannot be reconciled with known calendars. Audio captures sometimes include overlapping sound layers attributed to separate moments. Visual feeds may show structures or individuals before their documented construction or arrival. The Inquisition does not interpret these as prophetic or sentient acts. They are classified as data integrity failures induced by exposure to unstable reality states. Nevertheless, the files recommend permanent sealing rather than correction, citing the risk of conceptual contamination. There are also records concerning deliberate use of servo skulls by the Inquisition itself beyond standard reconnaissance roles. These cases are sparse and heavily compartmentalized. In such deployments, servo skulls are treated as disposable observation assets placed in environments where conventional agents cannot operate without detection or risk of compromise. Classified notes indicate that servo skulls are favored in situations where presence must be deniable and loss acceptable. Their human origin grants them symbolic neutrality in many Imperial spaces where more overt Inquisitorial instruments might provoke resistance or scrutiny. Once these operations conclude, the servo skulls involved are rarely retrieved. Their final status is listed as operationally irrelevant. One particularly sealed classification concerns what is termed residual authority recognition. In several investigations, servo skulls are observed responding to individuals who no longer hold formal command or, in some cases, are deceased. These responses include altered flight paths, activation of recording systems, or vocalized acknowledgements. The Mechanicus attributes this behavior to outdated command imprint protocols embedded during initial sanctification. The Inquisition accepts this explanation but notes its implications. A servo skull may recognize authority that no longer exists, acting on a hierarchy that has collapsed. Classified commentary identifies this as a risk vector in environments where legitimacy is contested or transitional. Inquisitorial analysis also addresses the psychological effect of servo skulls on Imperial personnel. While not the primary focus of most files, repeated observations note that their presence normalizes surveillance without attribution. Individuals behave as though they are being observed, but rarely question by whom or for what purpose. The servo skull becomes an ambient symbol of oversight rather than a specific instrument of control. The Inquisition regards this as neither intentional indoctrination nor accidental benefit, but as a reinforcing byproduct of Imperial culture. Classified remarks suggest that removing servo skulls entirely from a facility often produces more unrest than leaving them in place, as their absence is interpreted as abnormal. Final inquisitorial thoughts on servo skulls, as recorded in sealed doctrinal reviews, are notably restrained. There is no recommendation for reform, prohibition, or expansion of their use. Instead, servo skulls are categorized as stable contaminants, elements that introduce uncertainty, but do so consistently enough to be accounted for. They are not considered a heretical technology, nor are they fully trusted. Their value lies in persistence rather than precision. They endure where documentation fails, where authority changes, and where memory erodes. The Inquisition ultimately frames Servo Skulls as reflections of the Imperium itself. They're constructed from remnants of the dead, sustained by ritual and habit, and employed without complete understanding by institutions too vast to audit themselves fully. Classified summaries emphasize that Servo Skulls are not dangerous because they act, but because they remain. They accumulate context without context being accumulated about them. They observe without interpretation, and in doing so become vessels for unresolved data. In concluding assessments, Inquisitorial consensus avoids definitive judgment. Servo Skulls are permitted to exist because eliminating them would require a clarity of intent and administrative coherence the Imperium does not possess. They are watched when noticed and ignored when not. From the Inquisition's perspective, this is sufficient. The Imperium does not require tools that are perfect, it requires tools that last. Thus, Servo Skulls persist within classified files not as problems to be solved, but as constants to be managed. Their classified status is not a mark of exceptional importance, but of accepted ambiguity. They are neither sanctioned nor condemned beyond their immediate use. They hover at the edge of relevance, awaiting the moment they intersect with something that matters enough to be noticed again.